first autumn, after Emily told her father who she truly was, the maple outside their kitchen window turned a deeper red than Thomas had ever seen in his 62 years of watching seasons change. He'd spent that entire summer avoiding the truth that had been laid bare across their dinner table on a rainy June evening, words that had hung in the air like the persistent humidity that followed, making it difficult to breathe in a house that suddenly felt foreign. Thomas remembered how his coffee mug had trembled slightly in his weathered hand that morning, as he stood watching the crimson leaves dance against the pale blue sky. 6 months had passed since Emily knew Ethan now. He reminded himself with a heaviness that felt like stones in his pockets, had spoken those words that redefined everything Thomas thought he knew about his only child. "The leaves are changing early this year," he had mumbled to no one. His wife Margaret had been gone 3 years now, taken by the same cancer that had claimed her mother. In the silence of her absence, Thomas often found himself speaking aloud, as if the walls might offer some response. Sometimes he imagined Margaret answering him, telling him what to do, how to understand this new reality where his daughter was becoming his son before his very eyes. The kitchen phone had rung then, startling him from his thoughts. It was Ethan, calling from the city where he'd moved shortly after their argument. Thomas had said things that night, terrible, cutting things born of fear and incomprehension that he couldn't take back. Words that had driven a wedge between them, causing Ethan to pack a single suitcase and leave the next morning with nothing but a hastily scribbled note on the counter, saying he needed space to become himself. Thomas had been surprised by the call, answering with a gruff hello that masked the sudden quickening of his heart. Ethan wanted to visit that weekend, if that was okay. There was a long pause on the line as Thomas struggled to find his voice, finally managing to say yes, that would be fine. He'd make up the spare room. Ethan had corrected him, gently, no need for that. He'd book a room at the inn downtown. The conversation had been brief, formal in a way that conversations between fathers and children should never be. After hanging up, Thomas had stood motionless in the kitchen, listening to the ticking of the old clock that had belonged to Margaret's grandmother. The sound had always been comforting before, a steady reminder of continuity and tradition. Now it seemed to mock him, counting down the moments until he would have to face a truth he wasn't sure he could accept. Friday evening brought with it a chill that seeped through the cracks around the windows of Thomas's aging farmhouse. He had spent the day in a frenzy of nervous energy, dusting shelves that hadn't been touched in months, organizing the refrigerator, even changing the oil in his truck, though it wasn't due for another 1,000 miles. Anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from wandering into the territory of what was to come. At precisely 6 o'clock, headlights swept across the living room wall as a car pulled into the gravel driveway. Thomas stood from his recliner, his knees protesting with a familiar creak that reminded him of his age. He smoothed down his flannel shirt, recently ironed for the occasion, and made his way to the front door with measured steps. When he opened it, the person standing on the porch was both familiar and a stranger. Ethan stood taller somehow, shoulders squared beneath a dark blue sweater that Thomas had never seen before. His hair was cut short, and there was a shadow of stubble on a jawline that seemed more defined than Thomas remembered. But the eyes, Margaret's eyes, were exactly the same, looking at him with a mixture of apprehension and hope that made Thomas's chest tighten. Neither of them moved to embrace. Instead, Thomas stepped back, welcoming Ethan inside with a gesture that felt inadequate for the moment. He offered to take the leather jacket that Ethan shrugged off, hanging it on the hook by the door where Emily's old purple coat had once hung. The conversation over dinner was stilted, revolving around safe topics: the weather, Thomas's garden, the renovation of the town square. Ethan spoke of his new job at a graphic design firm in the city, his voice deeper than before but still carrying the same thoughtful cadences that Thomas associated with the child who had once sat at this very table, asking endless questions about how the world worked. It wasn't until they moved to the living room, each with a cup of tea that Thomas had carefully prepared, that the facade began to crack. Ethan placed his mug on the coffee table and said there was something he wanted to show his father. From a small bag, he retrieved a photo album, not one Thomas recognized from their home, but a new one with a plain black cover. As Thomas opened it, his breath caught. The first photo was of Emily at 5 years old, dressed in Thomas's oversized work boots and hat, grinning with dirt smudged across her cheeks after helping him in the garden. The next showed her at 8, clutching a trophy from the science fair where she'd built a model of the solar system that had impressed even the high school physics teacher. Page after page documented moments from a childhood that Thomas had always seen through one lens, but now was being asked to re-examine through another. Then came the newer photos: Ethan at a rally surrounded by others holding signs advocating for transgender rights. Ethan with friends Thomas had never met, smiling in a way that Thomas couldn't remember seeing in the years before the revelation. Ethan standing proudly beside a desk in an office with his name plaque visible in the foreground. Thomas felt his eyes burn as he turned the pages, his fingers trembling slightly against the plastic sleeves that protected each memory. Ethan explained quietly that he wanted his father to see that while much had changed, the core of who he was remained the same curiosity, the same determination, the same heart. When Thomas reached the final page, he found a letter addressed to him in the familiar handwriting that had once filled birthday cards for him and Margaret. He looked up at Ethan, a question in his eyes. Ethan nodded, encouraging him to read it now or later, whenever he felt ready. It contained everything Ethan had wanted to say over the past 6 months, but couldn't find the right words for over the phone or in the brief, tension-filled text messages they had exchanged. Thomas closed the album carefully, placing it on the table between them. He would read the letter later, when he was alone and could process the emotions it would undoubtedly stir. For now, there was a question that had been weighing on him, one he needed to ask, despite his fear of the answer. He asked Ethan if he was happy now, truly happy. The smile that spread across Ethan's face was answer enough, but he spoke anyway, telling his father that for the first time, he felt at home in his own skin. The constant discomfort, the persistent feeling of wrongness that had shadowed him since childhood, had finally begun to lift. He was becoming himself, not someone new, but the person he had always been beneath the surface. Thomas nodded slowly, taking in the words. He didn't understand everything, how could he, when the concept was so far removed from his own experience? But he recognized the authenticity in Ethan's expression, the relief in his voice, and somewhere in the depths of his confusion and grief for the daughter he thought he'd lost, a small spark of recognition flickered. This was still his child. As the evening wore on, the conversation gradually became less guarded. Thomas asked questions, haltingly at first, then with growing curiosity. Some were uncomfortably intrusive, but Ethan answered with patience, occasionally gently redirecting when Thomas's ignorance led him down inappropriate paths of inquiry. By the time Ethan left for his room at the inn, something had shifted between them. Not a complete reconciliation, but a tentative step toward understanding. Thomas stood on the porch long after the taillights of Ethan's rental car had disappeared down the road, listening to the rustle of leaves in the night breeze, and feeling as though the ground beneath his feet had altered subtly, yet irrevocably. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of perfect autumn day that seemed designed for new beginnings. Thomas rose early, as was his habit, and was surprised to find a text message from Ethan asking if he'd like to meet for breakfast at the diner in town. He replied with a simple yes, adding a period that he immediately worried might seem too curt, too indicative of the distance still between them. The Silver Spoon Diner had been a fixture in Mapleton for as long as Thomas could remember. He and Margaret had shared countless Sunday breakfasts there throughout their marriage, and later brought Emily along, always ordering the same thing: steak and eggs for Thomas, for Margaret, and chocolate chip pancakes for their child, who would methodically eat around each chocolate chip, saving them for last. Thomas arrived first, sliding into their usual booth by the window with its view of the town square and its central oak tree, now a blaze of orange and gold, When Ethan entered a few minutes later, Thomas noticed how several of the regular patrons glanced up with the curious looks that were inevitable in a small town. Ethan navigated the attention with a dignity that Thomas found himself admiring, nodding politely to those he recognized as he made his way to the table. They ordered coffee from Doris, who had been serving at the diner for over 30 years and had watched Emily grow up. If she was surprised by the changes in Thomas's child, she didn't show it beyond a momentary widening of her eyes. Instead, she squeezed Ethan's shoulder affectionately and remarked that it was good to see him home. The town had missed his face. When she asked if they wanted their usual orders, there was a moment of uncertainty. Ethan hesitated, then said no. Today he'd like the steak and eggs, medium rare with sourdough toast. Thomas felt something shift inside him at this small declaration of change, this departure from the pattern of years. When Doris turned to him expectantly, he surprised himself by ordering the chocolate chip pancakes, meeting Ethan's startled gaze with a small shrug. That might have been the beginning of a smile. As they waited for their food, Ethan asked about the renovations to the town square that Thomas had mentioned the previous evening. Thomas explained how the old gazebo had been restored after a storm had damaged it last winter, and how the town council was debating adding a small splash pad for children to enjoy during the summer months. It was easier somehow to talk here, in public, where the weight of their shared history seemed diluted by the bustle of the diner and the normalcy of breakfast conversation. When their food arrived, Thomas watched as Ethan cut into his steak, with the same methodical precision that had characterized Emily's approach to schoolwork and art projects, always careful, always thoughtful. Some things, it seemed, remained unchanged. Ethan noticed his father's observation and paused, knife and fork hovering above his plate. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Thomas saw a flicker of vulnerability, a silent question seeking approval, acceptance. Thomas found himself thinking of Margaret, wondering what she would do in this moment. She had always been the heart of their family, the one who knew intuitively how to bridge the gaps that formed between people. In the years since her death, Thomas had often felt adrift without her guidance. Now, faced with this profound challenge to everything he thought he understood about his child, he wished more than ever for her wisdom. But Margaret wasn't here. It was just him, just Thomas, with his limited understanding and his 70 years of living in a world that had seemed simpler than it actually was. He had to find his own way through this unfamiliar terrain. He picked up his fork and deliberately speared a chocolate chip, eating it first instead of saving it for last. It was a small gesture, almost meaningless to anyone watching, but in the private language of their family, it spoke volumes. Things change. Patterns break. Life moves forward in unexpected ways. Ethan's expression softened, the corner of his mouth lifting in recognition of the message. He resumed eating his breakfast, and they fell into a conversation about the painting hanging on the diner wall, a new addition since Ethan's last visit, depicting the town's founding in broad, impressionistic strokes of color. Art had always been common ground between them, even when other topics led to discord. After breakfast, Ethan suggested they take a walk through the town park. The suggestion surprised Thomas. The park held memories: Margaret teaching Emily to ride a bike without training wheels, family picnics on the 4th of July, the Christmas tree lighting ceremonies they had attended every year. It was a place saturated with the past. As they walked the familiar paths, now carpeted with fallen leaves and shades of amber and russet, Thomas found himself recounting stories from Ethan's childhood. The time Emily had climbed too high in the oak tree and needed the fire department to help her down. The summer afternoon when she had set up a lemonade stand to raise money for the animal shelter. The winter morning when they had made a family of snowmen, each wearing something that belonged to one. Ethan listened quietly, occasionally adding details that Thomas had forgotten, or filling in the story from his perspective. He didn't correct Thomas's use of she or Emily in these reminiscences, seemingly understanding that the past was still being rewritten in his father's mind, one memory at a time. They paused at the duck pond, watching as a mallard and his mate glided across the surface, leaving ripples in their wake. Thomas remembered bringing day-old bread here to feed the ducks, though a sign now advised visitors that bread was actually harmful to the birds. Another assumption overturned, another adjustment to be made. It was here, standing at the edge of the water that had reflected back countless versions of themselves over the years, that Ethan asked if Thomas had read the letter yet. Thomas shook his head, admitting that he hadn't found the courage yet. The letter waited on his bedside table, both invitation and challenge. Ethan nodded, understanding without judgment. He suggested that perhaps they could have dinner together again before he returned to the city the following day. Thomas agreed, feeling simultaneously relieved at the extension of their time together and apprehensive about what might come next in this careful reconstruction of their relationship. As they walked back toward town, a young mother passed by with a stroller. Her toddler, a boy of perhaps 3, was proudly wearing what appeared to be a princess dress over his jeans and t-shirts, a plastic tiara askew on his curly hair. The mother smiled at them in passing, completely at ease with her son's attire. Thomas watched them go, thinking about how the world had changed in his lifetime. He glanced at Ethan, who had also noticed the child, a wistful expression crossing his face briefly before being replaced by something like resolve. Ethan wondered aloud what kind of father Thomas thought he might have been if Emily had shown such inclinations as a young child. The question caught Thomas off guard, forcing him to consider not just the past as it had been, but as it might have been in a different world, with different understanding. He couldn't answer immediately, the words tangling in his throat as memories surfaced to Emily at 4, insisting on wearing Thomas's ties around the house. At 6, crying when Margaret bought her a dress for the first day of school. At 10, cutting her hair short with kitchen scissors the night before school pictures, resulting in an emergency trip to the hairdresser to fix the jagged edges. There had been signs, Thomas realized now, moments when Emily had been trying to tell them something that neither he nor Margaret had been equipped to hear. How much pain might have been avoided if they had understood sooner? How different might their journey have been? Thomas finally replied that he honestly didn't know what kind of father he would have been then, but he was trying to figure out what kind of father he could be now. It wasn't a complete answer, but it was a truthful one. Ethan seemed to accept this, nodding thoughtfully as they continued walking. The silence between them was no longer as heavy as it had been the day before, though it still carried the weight of all that remained unsaid. That evening, Thomas prepared dinner at home. Margaret's recipe for beef stew, that had been a family favorite. The familiar process of chopping vegetables and searing meat was meditative, allowing his mind to wander through the events of the day, the slow thawing that was occurring between him and Ethan. When Ethan arrived, he brought a bottle of red wine and a loaf of sourdough bread from the local bakery. They moved around the kitchen together, setting the table and putting the finishing touches on the meal with the awkward choreography of 2 people relearning how to share a space. Over dinner, their conversation meandered through Safer Territories books they had read recently, a documentary series Ethan recommended, the repairs Thomas was planning for the house before winter set in. It wasn't until they were finishing their meal that Ethan broached the subject they had been circling all weekend. He asked Thomas what he found hardest about the changes. It was a direct question, one that cut through the careful politeness that had characterized much of their interaction. Thomas set down his fork, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. After a long moment, he admitted that it was the loss of certainty that troubled him most. For 70 years, he had moved through the world believing he understood its fundamental truths. Boy, girl, mother, father. The categories had seemed fixed, immutable. Now, he was being asked to reconsider everything, to accept that the boundaries he had taken for granted were more permeable than he had ever imagined. And beyond that, Thomas confessed, was the fear that he had failed as a father, that his inability to see who Ethan truly was had caused pain that could never fully heal. Ethan listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving his father's face. When Thomas finally fell silent, Ethan told him about his own journey of understanding, how it had taken years of confusion and self-doubt before he could name the disconnect. He felt between his inner self and the body he inhabited. He spoke of the relief of finally finding the words to describe his experience, of meeting others who shared similar stories, of the gradual process of becoming visible to himself. It wasn't Thomas's fault, Ethan assured him, that he hadn't recognized what Ethan himself had only come to understand in his 20s. The important thing was what happened now, how they chose to move forward from this point. Thomas felt something loosen in his chest at these words, a constriction he hadn't fully acknowledged until it began to ease. He reached across the table hesitantly, placing his weathered hand palm up in a silent invitation. Ethan placed his own hand in his father's, the familiar shape of fingers that reminded Thomas so much of Margaret's. For a long moment, they simply sat that way, connected by touch in a way that transcended the complexities of gender and identity. Father and child, linked by blood and history, and the tentative promise of a future together. When Ethan left that night, their goodbye was different from the formal farewell of the previous evening. Thomas embraced his son awkwardly, patting his back in the somewhat stiff manner of men who have not been taught how to express physical affection easily. It wasn't perfect, but it was genuine. And when Ethan returned the embrace with a fierceness that spoke of long-suppressed emotion, Thomas felt something break and mend simultaneously within his heart. After Ethan's departure, Thomas found himself standing once again at the kitchen window, looking out at the maple tree whose leaves had first caught his attention at the beginning of this weekend of reconciliation. In the darkness, he could barely make out its shape, but he knew that in the morning light, those crimson leaves would again demand his notice, reminding him of the beauty that can emerge from transformation. He made his way upstairs slowly, feeling the weight of the day in his tired muscles and racing mind. The letter still waited on his bedside table, Ethan's careful handwriting visible on the envelope. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, turning it over in his hands several times before finally finding the courage to open it. The pages inside were filled with words that Ethan had needed to say, and that Thomas needed to hear about the years of confusion and pain, the therapy sessions that had helped Ethan understand himself, the fear of rejection that had nearly prevented him from ever telling his parents the truth. But there were also expressions of gratitude for the love that had sustained him, even in his darkest moments. Memories of times when Thomas and Margaret had unknowingly affirmed his true self through their acceptance of his differences from other girls his age. The final paragraph was what broke Thomas completely, releasing tears he had held back throughout the weekend of careful conversation and cautious reconnection. Dad, I am still the same person who loved helping you in the garden, who learned to change the oil in the truck under your patient guidance, who inherited Mom's terrible singing voice and your stubbornness. I am still your child. The name has changed, and the pronouns have changed, but the love hasn't. I'm hoping that with time, you'll see that nothing essential has been lost, that perhaps something has been gained, the chance for us to know each other with greater honesty than ever before. I'm not asking you to understand everything immediately. I'm just asking for the opportunity to move forward together, finding our way one day at a time. Thomas read the letter twice more, letting the words sink into his consciousness, challenging and comforting him in equal measure. Then he placed it carefully in the drawer of his bedside table, alongside the sympathy cards he had received after Margaret's passing and the handwritten recipe for her beef stew that he had used that evening. As he prepared for bed, Thomas found himself thinking about the changing seasons, how the brilliant display of autumn foliage was actually the result of the trees preparing for winter, conserving their resources until the time was right for new growth. Perhaps this transformation in his family was not so different a necessary process, sometimes painful but ultimately making way for something new to emerge. He didn't have all the answers. He knew that the path ahead would include missteps and misunderstandings. There would be days when he would struggle with pronouns and memories, when the gap between his understanding and Ethan's reality would seem impossibly wide. But for the first time since that rainy June evening when everything had changed, Thomas felt something like hope. In the morning, he would call Ethan to wish him a safe journey back to the city. And perhaps, in that conversation, he would find the courage to use his son's chosen name without hesitation. To take another step on this unfamiliar path they were now walking together. Outside, a gust of wind shook the maple tree, sending a shower of crimson leaves spiraling to the ground. Thomas watched them fall, thinking about how Margaret had always loved this time of year, how she had seen beauty in the letting go that autumn represented. He wished she were here to guide him through this season of change in their family, but perhaps she was. As Thomas finally drifted toward sleep, he found himself hoping that Ethan might visit again when the leaves had fallen and the first snow transformed the landscape. They could build a snowman together, as they had in years past, each contributing something of themselves to its creation. It would be different from those childhood memories, but no less meaningful for the change. In the darkness of his bedroom, with Margaret's absence a familiar ache, and Ethan's letter a new comfort, Thomas made a silent promise to himself and to his family to learn to listen, to recognize that some things remained constant even as others changed, like the cycle of seasons that had guided his farmer's life for 7 decades. Love, after all, was one of those constants. It might take new forms, speak in different voices, answer to other names, but at its core, it remained what it had always been. The thread that connected them across time and change and understanding. The maple tree outside would lose its leaves. The winter would come with its stillness and cold, but spring would follow eventually, bringing with it the possibility of new growth, new understanding, new beginnings. And Thomas would be there to witness it, to be part of it, one day at a time.